tweens still use social media. So 38% of children aged 8 to 12 use social media. That's quite a bit, given that most of these social media platforms are only eligible for youth who are either 12 or 13 years of age and older. So these children are bypassing even some of the restrictions that are in place for social media use. And 84% of teenagers are using social media. And nearly 1 in 5 use social media every day. And this percentage of tweens that are using social media increased from pre-pandemic. So Common Sense Media did a census back in 2019 before COVID-19. And at that time, 31% of teens were using, or tweens, I apologize, were using social media. And so in this chart, you'll see that the top social media sites among tweens included sites like Snapchat, Instagram, and Facebook, and that the top media sites among teenagers included Instagram and Snapchat. This census looked at about 1,300 youth in the United States, ages 8 to 18 years old. And this census, or this survey, oversampled the Black population to make sure that they were represented in the survey as well. And the survey was conducted using a third party called Knowledge Panel, and that uses a scientifically based randomized method to ensure that the randomization is accurate and true, and that it reflects the general population. Pew Research Center also conducted a research study or a survey in 2022, and they looked at about 1,300 sets or pairs. I'm sorry, Deborah, did you have a question? No. They looked at about 1,300 pairs or dyads of a teenager and a parent. And they used that same survey method through Knowledge Panel to access data or to gather data. And according to their research, about 1 in 5 teenagers visit or use YouTube almost constantly. So although social media platforms like Instagram and Snapchat are very popular, the video site of YouTube is actually the most utilized screen media that teenagers utilize. So why even talk about social media and youth mental health? We want to talk about it so we can understand the impact of social media. Currently, there really isn't a lot of research that can be done. It's almost impractical to be able to conduct, double-blinded randomized control studies on social media. However, we can do naturalistic studies. We can do longitudinal studies. And currently, the body of research suggests that while there are benefits to social media use, there are also indicators of profound risk of harm to mental health and well-being. So, according to the Surgeon General, I apologize if I missed someone speaking. I'm going to continue. So, according to the Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, I'm going to give a lengthy quote. Quote, "At this time, we do not have enough evidence to determine if social media is sufficiently safe for children and adolescents. We must acknowledge the growing body of research about the potential harms, increase our collective understanding of the risks associated with social media use, and urgently take action to create safe and healthy digital environments to minimize harm and safeguard children's and adolescents' mental health and well-being during this critical stage of development." And from that quote, that was the main part that stood out to me. Social media is impacting youth particularly more than our transitional age population or even adults because of the stage of development in which they're at. So let's talk about that a little bit more. When we break down development, I break down development into the neurodevelopment component and the psychosocial development component, and both are interlinked. Neurodevelopmentally, second only to childhood or early childhood, adolescence is a time of major nervous system reconstruction. You have pruning. So you're going to take all those extra side roads that the brain has created and no longer needs, and it's going to prune them away and create highway systems. It's going to create what we call myelination. It's going to there's going to be a reduction in gray matter and increase in white matter. And then you're also going to see, because of this myelination process and pruning process, the brain does it from back to front first. So the back of our brain is going to become more mature first versus the front. So that means our prefrontal cortex is going to be the last thing to mature. And that usually matures around 25 years of age or so. It's a little bit later if you have neurodevelopmental disorders. So that asynchronous maturation means that our amygdala in teenagers is going to be really strong. It's going to be mature early on. And you combine that with hormonal changes, you are setting up a period of instability and change for youth. And this is important, though. The pruning and the myelination is really important because I link it with psychosocial development. So you'll see here Ericksonian stages of psychosocial development. And you'll notice that that school age is the age of those tweens, the 8 to 12-year-old range. And they're currently working through that concept of being industrious, being successful versus an inferiority complex. And they're also working, as they transition into adolescence, they're going to be working through identity formation. And if that identity formation doesn't happen in a supportive, nurturing environment, it can lead to a lot of role confusion for them. And then we're transitioning from adolescence into young adulthood, that 18 to 25-year range, where intimacy is going to be really important, that idea of connection, versus if we can't thrive with forming intimate relationships, it might lead to isolation. So I link neurodevelopment to psychosocial development through the concepts of pruning and myelination. When you think about pruning, it's taking all those extra side roads you don't need, you're not going to be utilizing, and it is forming highway systems to those pathways that you want to nurture and develop. Say you want to be an athlete, a ballerina, or you want to be an artist. We are going to be creating more direct lines or direct networks to channel and foster our individuation. And then we're going to be using the myelination process to form some of those connections. So developmentally overall, it's normal for teens to have this sense of infallibility in the world. They almost have this positive illusory bias because their amygdala is so strong. And what this means is that that positive illusory bias, or that sense of infallibility, it suggests that a teenager predicts that another teenager will experience, or another adult will experience, more negative experiences or outcomes than they would themselves. They think that they're immune to any negative impact of most impulsive or dangerous decisions. And a lot of the time during this developmental period, during the ages of being a tween to a teenager, there's a lot going on. And I've listed a few things here, but I would love the audience to participate in and offer what they've noticed that they themselves, or teenagers, their own kids or teenagers that they see, work with, are experiencing that can impact their mental health.
Would it be okay if we talked or put it in the chat?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't have access to the chat right now because I'm in presenter mode or share screen mode. But if
Okay.
someone does write something in the chat, maybe Bridget or someone can read it out loud.
But yeah, I guess I'll just say it out loud if you're not able to see the chat.
Mhm,
But I do know of some teenagers in my own life, and some of them are suffering from like eating disorders.
mhm.
And
Yes,
that's something that some teens go through.
yep, yeah. It's the age that an eating disorder will develop. So yes, and it is one of the most lethal disorders, psychiatric disorders that can happen. Mhm.
I'm wondering about their concern about climate change,
Yeah,
particularly given our experience here
yes, yes,
locally. But I'm hearing this concept of eco-anxiety,
yes.
and that this younger generation is very, alarmed.
Exactly. Yeah, eco anxiety is real, especially with the climate changes we've experienced in Butte County ourselves. Mhm. You know, other challenges that youth may face include school demands, having just negative feelings about themselves as they're forming their own identity, changes in their bodies that could lead to a misperception of body image, and it could lead to an eating disorder, problems with interpersonal problems with peers and even parents, especially as they try and navigate with parents that sense of independence and reliance. You're sort of stuck in that, in between those two at that age. Chronic illnesses and family members, managing moves or taking on too many activities. Half of all lifetime cases of mental illness begin by age 14 and 75% by the age of 24, according to the National Institute of Mental Health. And all of these mental health concerns can lead to a fight, flight, freeze response. I even put please in there, that sometimes one of our defenses is to accommodate others, maybe to a degree that's not appropriate. It can lead to anxiety, withdrawal, aggression, overwhelm. It can also then lead to, if we're not managing that, poor coping skills, substance use to try and cope with it. It could lead to mental illness itself and physical illness. So being a teenager is fraught with a lot of concerns. And social media may actually provide a community and connection for others who share identities, abilities, and interests with them. So social media in and of itself is not fully detrimental. It could be helpful. It could allow youth a space for self-expression. It could allow them to have or form friendships with people that they normally may not meet in their community. And it could be a buffer against stress for youth who are often marginalized, such as those who are of racial, ethnic, sexual, or gender minorities. It could also enable peer connection and identity development and management and support. It could affirm your identity, especially related to race. And then it could also serve as a gateway to seeking mental health care. We'll get to that a little bit later. It can also serve as a gateway to being influenced by influencers who are not experts in self-diagnosing too. But I wanted to just relay this fact from Common Sense, or this data from Common Sense Media survey. They surveyed over 1,300 girls ages 11 to 15 years old from November to December of 2022. And they found that 7 out of 10 adolescent girls of color reported that social media provided that positive or identity affirming content that they needed in their lives. And teenagers, according to the Pew Research Center survey in 2022, say that they actually feel accepted. 58% feel accepted using social media. They feel supported. 67% feel supported through tough times. 71% feel like they have a place to show that creativity. And 80% believe that they actually are able to connect with their friends a little bit better. So those are the benefits of social media, but we know that social media in and of itself can be problematic. So a longitudinal cohort study of US adolescents aged 12 to 15 years old with this cohort study included nearly 6,500 youth, found that adolescents who spent more than 3 hours per day on social media faced double the risk of experiencing poor mental health outcomes, including symptoms of depression and anxiety. What I found interesting about that study is that it was a U-shaped curve. So what that meant is less than 3 hours, or there was a range. So less than an hour and a half a day of social media use actually wasn't helpful. It created symptoms of depression and anxiety as well, but not to the full extent. And there was a sweet range between like 1 to 3 hours a day, where if you use social media, it was actually protective and you didn't experience depression and anxiety. But if you experience the other arm more than 3 hours, or if you used social media for more than 3 hours a day, you had poorer health outcomes. There was another interesting study, and this was one of those natural experiments that was leveraged when Facebook was rolled out across US colleges. And when they looked back at it, that rollout of Facebook was associated with an increase of depression, about 9% over baseline, and an increase in anxiety of about 12% over baseline among college-aged youth. And this sample included 360,000 college-aged kids almost. And then another study conducted among 14-year-olds in the United Kingdom, or UK, found that greater social media use predicted poor sleep, online harassment, poor body image, low self-esteem, and higher depressive symptom scores. And these larger symptom scores were more prevalent or more commonly associated with girls than boys. And that is just from social media itself. From now, when we look at content exposure, we can think about the exposure to suicide and self-harm related content and risk-taking challenges on social media platforms that can lead to childhood deaths. A systematic review of more than 24 studies found that some social media platforms show live depictions of self-harm acts like partial asphyxiation and cutting. And you do sometimes get the copying behavior, the mimicking behavior. A synthesis of 20 studies demonstrated that there is a significant relationship between social media use and body image concerns. So speaking to your point, I believe it was Trent, that body image concerns and eating disorders arise during these teenage years, and there might be a correlation with social media use. Again, all of these studies cannot prove a causal relationship because we're not doing double-blind RCTs, but we can infer a correlation from most of these studies. Roughly 2/3, about 64% of adolescents are often or sometimes exposed to hate-based content too. So in this image, among adolescent girls of color, 1/3 or more report exposure to racist content or language on social media platforms at least monthly. So the monthly is the lighter blue right here. And what I found interesting is that it matches the real life experience as well. So exposure to racism on social media, especially through TikTok or Instagram, almost matches their real life exposure too. And Instagram was where most young ladies felt the most hate-based content. In a review of 36 studies, there was a consistent relationship between cyberbullying and depression among children and adolescents, and it was greater in female adolescents and sexual minority youth. So older teen girls experienced more cyberbullying. They experienced, especially those who are 15 to 17 years of age. Adolescent girls and transgender youth are at a greater impact or greater vulnerability of impact by online harassment and abuse, which is associated with negative emotional impacts, such as feeling sad, anxious, or worried. And nearly 6 in 10 adolescent girls say they've been contacted by a stranger on certain social media platforms in ways that make them feel uncomfortable. So you can see, again, most of that unwanted contact is coming from Instagram, about 58%. Some of it's coming from, nearly similarly to Instagram, is coming from Snapchat. And then you have TikTok and YouTube. Again, with content exposure across platforms, in a review of 36 studies, again, if we found that, or in a review based off of that, the Common Sense social media survey, they found that across platforms, LGBTQ plus adolescents are roughly twice as likely as non-LGBTQ plus adolescents to encounter hate speech related to sexual or gender identity. In addition to content exposure and social media itself, you have the potential risk of exposure to harm from excessive and problematic use. And so problematic use is use that is more compulsive in nature. And it may be associated with distinct changes in the developing brain, especially that amygdala and prefrontal cortex, and it could increase our sensitivity to social rewards and punishments. And where else have we heard that phrase of social rewards and punishment, or mostly reward-based learning? We've heard it through addiction. And so it's important to recognize that this could be problematic behavior because of addiction too. And as such, adolescents may experience heightened emotional sensitivity to communication and interactions through social media because that amygdala is more mature than the prefrontal cortex. So the amygdala, which is important for emotional learning and behavior, is super strong, and it almost overruns or supersedes the prefrontal cortex's ability to hit the brakes, to provide impulse inhibition, provide that emotional regulation and moderate social behavior. And according to a recent model, nearly a third or 31% of social media use may be attributable to self-control challenges magnified by habit formation. And some researchers believe that social media use can overstimulate the reward center in the brain. And when the stimulation becomes excessive, it can trigger pathways comparable to addiction. And according to the Pew Research Center, from that research conducted in April to May of 2022, 54% of teens already believe it's hard for them to give up social media. In a recent systematic review of 42 studies on the effects of excessive social media use, they found a consistent relationship between social media use and poor sleep quality, reduced sleep duration, and sleep difficulties in adolescents. And we know sleep is imperative for anyone's well-being. Additionally, social media induced fear of missing out, or FOMO, or that pervasive apprehension that others are having rewarding experiences from which you're absent. That FOMO experience has been associated with increasing symptoms of depression, anxiety, and neuroticism in adolescents. So what do we do about some of the potential harms of social media use? Who is supposed to do this for us? Or who is supposed to do this or help? So we have a breakdown according to the Surgeon General of policymakers, tech companies, healthcare providers, parents, care providers, children, adolescents, and researchers. And as policymakers, the hope is that policymakers will start looking at developing age-appropriate health and safety standards for tech platforms that require higher standards for data privacy. So things that they could do to do that would be to increase funding for research and support the development and implementation and valuation of digital and media literacy in schools and within academic standards. Tech companies are also responsible. Nearly 75% of adolescents say that social media sites are only doing a fair to poor job of addressing online harassment and cyberbullying. So a large majority of teens think that actually parents are doing an excellent and good job. About 66% of teenagers believe that. But you can see that teenagers believe that law enforcement, social media sites themselves, and our policymakers, our elected officials are not doing a service to them. Does that come as a surprise to anyone, that teenagers believe parents are doing a good job?
It is kind of a surprise.
Yeah, I thought so too, because most teenagers get grumpy with you. Technology companies could conduct and facilitate transparent and independent assessments of social media, and they could share that data. They could establish scientific advisory committees to inform their approaches and policies. They could prioritize user health and safety by setting default settings for children so that children with access to social media are allowed the highest privacy standards, and they could enforce that age minimum as well. And as healthcare providers, I'm curious, what are some of the practices that the providers here in this presentation today are utilizing or doing to either assess for social media use or provide education or guidance? I know I personally will sometimes forget to ask about social media use. I often ask about it during our initial visit, and then I'll circle back to it every once in a while, especially if and I'll circle back to it more so actually if they've identified cyberbullying as one of the traumas they've experienced in their life. But I'm wondering, how do you go about assessing for social media use or online video use? One of the ways I do it is I ask the teenager themselves. I'll even ask youth starting at the age of 8, hey, how much screen time do you have? What do you like to use? What video games do you play? Oh, can you chat on those video games? Because chatting on video games using platforms like Discord could be an easy way for tweens to become targeted. I'll review the risks and benefits of use with teenagers as well. The most common thing I review with them is the difference between an influencer and an expert. And that to me is a a huge component of the psychoeducation I provide, because teenagers often come to me thinking that they have schizophrenia or that they have bipolar disorder or that they have borderline personality disorder or that they even have tics or Tourette syndrome, whatever may be the hot topic on TikTok or Instagram. So I'll review what makes an influencer and what makes an expert an expert. And I encourage them to look more into websites that are expert-based. I also will have a discussion with parents. Not always, I'm guilty of not always having this conversation, but most of the time when I feel like it's necessary, I'll have a conversation with parents about their own social media use or their own screen use and how we can model for our tweens and adolescents to have a healthier relationship with social media, because technology is not going away. Screens are not going away. So if we as adults can help model a healthy relationship with media, social media particularly, we can guide our youth to do the same. We can help, as healthcare providers, help provide guidelines for physical activity and sleep, and even encourage family and media use plans. And you can find one such plan through healthychildren.org/media use plan. And that is a plan that the AAP, or the American Academy of Pediatrics, recommends using. And as parents and care providers, like we're talking about, providing that psychoeducation about modeling a healthy relationship with technology use, parents and care providers can then in turn create tech-free zones, such as at the dinner table or even the bedroom. Has anyone found a solution or a good strategy for this? One of the strategies that has worked for me is using the sleep mode on my phone. So I set it for a certain time and I don't get any notifications then for at least 9.5 hours. I didn't do the math. And that really helps. Yes.
I actually do the same thing. I usually put sleep mode on my phone. It really helps me with the notifications.
Yes. Oh, I'm glad. And I think that's a good boundary to have with technology. So I'm glad it's been helpful for you. We can encourage children to foster in-person relationships. We can model responsible social media behavior, and we can teach kids about technology and empower them to responsibly participate. We can also report the cyberbullying and online abuse. There are places online where you can report it, the cyber tip line, or take it down. And we could also limit the use of phones. Children and adolescents can limit the use of phones and tablets and computers 1 hour before bedtime. They can develop strategies such as tracking the amount of time they're using or blocking unwanted content or contacts, and learning about and utilizing the available privacy and safety settings. And teenagers can also turn off notifications. They can report harassment and bullying. And as parents, I hope, as educators, as health providers, we can help encourage children and adolescents to foster those in-person relationships and activities as well. And researchers can continue to research the risks and benefits, provide more longitudinal or robust cohort studies. They can prioritize interventional strategies and study if those interventional strategies are effective. And they can take what they learn and inform policymakers, educators, and technology companies. So in conclusion, tweens and adolescents are going through numerous neurodevelopmental and psychosocial developmental changes that makes them more vulnerable to the impact of social media use. Social media use, though, can be helpful to foster connection and provide a space for creative self-expression, but it could worsen depression, anxiety. It could expose youth to harmful content, and it could impact their sleep. And adolescent girls of color, LGBTQ plus youth are more vulnerable to this negative content exposure. And technology is not going away. So collectively, we have to work together to research, guide, and educate and model appropriate use for our adolescents. So one of the things I might have missed, I'm not sure where the slide went. Let's see if I can find it. Okay, here it is. One of the things that gets disrupted from excessive and problematic social media use is our default mode network. So our brain has network systems like the DMN, the default mode network. It has the limbic system, the salience network, the dorsal attentive network, the central executive network, the visual system. The default mode network is responsible for remembering the past, thinking about the future, for reflecting on our emotional state, for considering decisions about loved ones, for even thinking about others and their emotions or beliefs, or developing that quote unquote theory of mind, or honing it. It's responsible for forming new memories and retrieving knowledge. So that default mode network is very important. It's that network of our brain that is most active when we're not doing anything. It's the one that allows for daydreaming, for reflection, mind wandering. So when that network gets disrupted, or there's dysfunction in it, or it never has a time to develop because we're constantly being engaged with social media or video content, it impairs that inability to develop that default mode network can cause impaired social interactions and communications. It can lead to negative ruminations, suicidal ideas, and it could impair our ability to encode long-term memories. And this in turn can lead to other psychiatric conditions, including depression, PTSD, autism, schizophrenia, anxiety, OCD, and even substance use. So I apologize for skipping over that slide. That was one of the connections I wanted to make with why excessive and problematic use of social media can impact a youth's ability to foster their theory of mind.
I have a question.
Yes.
So I know you mentioned some peer studies, I think, with adolescents and with their parents. Do you know if there's been research as far as looking to see, because I feel like it's hard to ask this question to frame it, but basically, I feel like a lot of my friends who have kids, they just let their kids use the phones and videos and stuff as much as they want. And then there's other friends who say, okay, we can only use the iPad for an hour, or, like you can do it for 10 minutes or something like that. Like, is there any research to say kind of how parents are having an effect on this? Because I feel like some of it, social media was around when we were kids, but like it wasn't as big a thing. And I feel like my parents were never on social media, so I never saw that behavior in them,
Yeah. And I'm sure there are research studies for that. I just don't know any off the top of my head. So I apologize. If I find any, I can definitely send them your way.
Yeah, because I kind of wonder how much is the problem with social media itself versus the problem with parents not kind of providing other options or encouraging their children to do other things. Because if the kids see their parents on social media all day, that's probably what they're going to do too.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that was a modeling behavior we're talking about, even though, like you said, in your generation, it wasn't modeled for you. And I'm not sure what your relationship with social media is now. But I do think that setting boundaries for children, for adolescents, is really helpful to protect them, even though they may not feel like it. And to a certain degree, teenagers do feel like parents are helpful. They feel protected by parents, and so I think setting those boundaries actually may be helpful. And again, it goes to that point of our researchers conducting studies or looking at interventional strategies, and then communicating those interventional strategies, such as limiting screen time. If parents limit screen time for adolescents, how does that impact health outcomes later on down the road? Dr. Kinder, do you have other questions? Did I answer that?
Yeah, no, I feel like it's hard, like you said. I mean, you can't really do randomized controlled studies with this sort of thing. And so how much of it are we able to find, okay, this is just an effect of social media, or this is an effect of, kind of a lack of support in general, or, other issues with, some pre-existing depression or anxiety, and that's why they're choosing to be on social media rather than out with friends in the real world. So I feel like it's very hard to figure out those sorts of things. And even with, like you were saying, the sleep issues. And I know they've always, even before we talked about social media, we talked about, don't have a TV on when you're going to bed,
Yes.
don't have your phone when you're going to bed. So is it there's an independent effect of social media on sleep, or is it the fact that you're using a screen, while you go to bed?
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the things I try and mention is to use that blue light filter. What other questions, concerns, comments are there?
Well, I wanted to thank you too. I thought it was interesting to hear about. I'm a ear, nose, and throat surgeon, so I don't do a lot of the screening stuff, but I do see adolescents. And so it's always interesting to hear more what's going on in their lives, because they often don't like to talk to doctors.
They do not.
I also did want to thank you as well, just because I'm in college right now doing my prerequisites for nursing, and a lot of my friends use social media, and I grew up with it too. And you always heard about there can be negative effects with it, but it was really interesting seeing the graphs and the information that's out there all in one place. So I thank you for that.
You're welcome. Yeah, and good luck to you. It's great. I think we need more healthcare providers, especially healthcare providers who are interested in preventive care. And this can be along the lines of preventive care.
Okay, I did think of another question, and it may be sort of like you were talking about the differential development of the parts of the brain, but I mean, we talk about a lot of, abuse situations, and people have a hard time getting out, an abusive marriage, if if you're financially dependent on the situation or things like that. But it seems like social media would be such an easy thing to just stop. Like, if you're getting abused every time you go on Snapchat, just don't go on Snapchat anymore. Like, is there any thought as to why the adolescents aren't just stopping when they go and it's such a negative experience?
Yeah, a lot of that has to do with the dopamine stimulation that occurs when the amygdala gets activated, and it leads to that positive reward response. Even just having that stimulation, even though it's not the best feeling, and you might need, again, just like with addiction, you might need a stronger dose or more to reach that same level of dopamine release. There are studies that indicate that screen time or getting likes or seeing comments actually stimulates dopamine release and then activates our reward system. Yeah, so unlike intimate partner violence, and similar to it too, when there is that connection, that feeling of safety when the relationship is going well, and you do get the endorphin release. Using social media is akin to that and also similar to the addiction pathway. Well, if there aren't any other questions or concerns, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak and for participating and being here and listening. Should you ever have any other questions, concerns, or just want to talk offline, Bridget, you're welcome to share my email.
Thank you, Dr. Kular. And also we need to
again.
thank Inlo for the CME credit. So thank you very much. And yes, I absolutely have Dr. Kular's email and I'm happy to forward on. So everyone
yes.
have a great day.
Hmm.